So when I walked in today into church, the first thing Kenny said to me was not good morning, how you doing? He said, you're wearing purple. Did you change teams? Rest assured, I did not. I'm still a Packer fan. I was born and raised in Milwaukee. I thought it was safe because it's not football season, but apparently it's year-round. So I learned something today. I'd like to invite you to go back with me in time, back to the year 2003. And if you had asked me back in 2003, I would have told you that I was an atheist, that I didn't believe in God. It wasn't really a strong passion or anything, I just didn't believe in him. But it was around that time, 2003, when I started attending church more regularly. And I brought proof. That's me in the back row. That's my wife next to me. You see, I was only in church to support her. She was moving in one direction towards God and Jesus, and I was moving in another. And I wasn't happy about it. When I was in church, I usually wasn't paying attention, but if I was, I'd be thinking, you know what? This is all made up. It's wishful thinking. Now, I have to come clean. I have to be honest. There were times that I went to church alone. And you can see my wife's not there. Why would an atheist go to church alone? That's a great question. I have kids. I have twins, a boy and a girl. Some of you may know them, William and Nicole. And at this time, they were 2 years old. And while I love them, they're great, they can be a little bit of a handful. And when my wife's out of town for the weekend, I have sole responsibility of them. And by Sunday, I need a break. The church has free child care. Let's fast forward, 2008. My kids are 7 years old. And it was at this time I realized that I had a problem. I was actually sitting in this church in the balcony. Some of you may or may not know that there used to be a balcony here. As an atheist, the balcony is great. You're in the back, far away. And this group came called Life Action, and I joined my wife and listened to them. And one night, they talked about morals. And they talked about raising your family and your kids. And that struck a chord with me. I have to teach them right from wrong. I have to teach them good morals. They're going to be teenagers soon. But I realized I had a big problem. We're going to roll the clock back now to 1989, and I was a teenager. Mr. Anti-Authority. I used alcohol, I used drugs, I used girls. Lots of regrets. I'm not a good role model. So what am I going to teach my kids? I can teach them someone else's definition of right and wrong, but that's just their opinion. And there's lots of opinions. Well, I've been going to church now for a little while, and I've been listening sometimes about Jesus, and he has a moral system, seems like it's a good moral system. And if he was God, which I didn't believe, but if he was God, that would be an objective moral standard. That's what started me on a journey. But the problem is, I'm a skeptic. And I question everything. So it actually ended up being a multi-year journey where I tried to discover the truth for myself. Because even as a skeptic, I'd never questioned why I believed what I believed. Today, I would like to share with you some of the evidence that I found, and we're going to talk about the Bible in particular. And what did I find in the Bible when I started looking? The first thing I want to talk about is the Bible authentic? And what I mean by that is the copies we have of the Bible, are they the same copies or the same of what was written 2,000 years ago? And we'll talk about the factual nature of the Bible. Is it fiction or nonfiction? Specifically, we'll talk about the New Testament. That's where I'm going to focus. First thing I learned that I didn't know was that it was 27 books, each a book in itself. And each book can actually be treated as a history book. But it was 2,000 years ago. I thought it was the telephone game, where you whisper something to someone and they whisper it. By the time you get to the end, it's wildly different than the beginning. That was my skepticism. That's what I figured happened with the Bible. Well, I found out there's a way you can tell if that happened or not. So let's walk through it a little bit. I have an original. So Luke, John, one of the originals wrote down something on paper or parchment or papyrus, whatever they had at the time. They wrote the original book. And then some copies get made. These are called manuscripts because they have to be copied by hand. It's 2,000 years ago. Some more copies get made. And eventually, this happens until the printing press, which is in the year 1400. So we have about 1,400 years of manuscripts. But we've lost the original. We've lost early copies. Due to fires, they weren't stored properly. It's fragile material. I mentioned the papyrus, the parchment paper, doesn't last that long. So we don't have all the copies. Well, it turns out that there is a discipline, I'll call it, called textual criticism. It's part science, part art. And here's what was interesting to me. It's not just for the Bible. This is a discipline that's used for all ancient literature, from Plato to Josephus, or any old ancient literature. And this discipline tells us just what I talked about. Is it authentic? How close do we think it is to the original? It looks at three things. The first is, how many copies do we have? You'll notice it says many. We have a lot of copies of the Bible. I'm not going to go into that detail. I'll tell you why in just a minute. The second thing it looks at is, how large is the time gap between the first manuscripts we have and when we think the original was written? The shorter the time gap, the closer they are to the original, the better. Now, I glossed over these, right? Because the Bible is really short too, and there's a reason I glossed over them. Because as a skeptic, they didn't mean anything to me, really. They were just numbers. It didn't resonate. It's really, really good evidence, but it didn't for me. Instead, there was something else that bothered me about the Bible and about the books of the Bible. Did you know that there's differences in the Bible? And I'm talking about differences, at this point we're going to talk about differences of one book, the book of Luke, for example. And all the copies we have of the book of Luke. There's differences amongst all those copies. Lots of them. And I figured that was the telephone game. This is Bart Ehrman. He is a pretty famous New Testament scholar. And he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus. And it's all about these differences. This is what he says in his book. There are more differences among our manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. That means there's over 180,000 differences in the New Testament. Right? As a skeptic, well, that kind of proves it, doesn't it? It's pretty startling. It's pretty powerful. There's a second or third criteria to textual criticism, which is how significant are the differences. But notice closely, because it's not saying, are there differences? It's saying, how significant are the differences? So Bart is calling out the differences. This is Bruce Metzger. He's also a New Testament scholar. Both Bart and Bruce work in textual criticism. And he has the same degrees as Bart. As a matter of fact, Bruce was Bart's professor. Much of what Bart learned, he learned from Bruce. He actually says he was a second father figure to him, a mentor. They were both Christians. And I say was because Bart ended up becoming an atheist, primarily over the issue of pain and suffering. So why do I bring this up? Why do I bring Bruce into the picture? Because if you dig a little deeper and you look at the appendix of that same book, you can read this. The position I argue for in Misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position. And here's the key thing: that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by the textual variants. So I give a little analogy. It's a crime scene analogy. I was a reserve sheriff deputy with Scott County for a number of years and learned a lot about law, and those analogies really resonate with me. If we have a crime scene and someone got shot, they're on the ground, and the paramedics are going to come in, right? And they're going to come in and they're going to try to save this person on the ground. Well, the paramedics are not going to be neat. They're not going to care about the crime scene. They're going to throw bandages around. They might even move the body, move things that are on the ground, and totally taint the scene. When the investigator comes in later, he's not going to look at it and say, I can't use this because it's all messed up. He's going to take effort. He's going to remove the artifacts, and he's going to get left with evidence. That's what textual criticism does, is it looks at the differences amongst all those copies. So the more copies you have, the better, which is why the Bible is so good, because they can look at these differences to try to get back to what the core was. As a matter of fact, only 1% of the differences affect any meaning at all. Most of it's punctuation, things like that. And as Bart is saying here, none of it affects the Christian doctrine. So you can check off the boxes of textual criticism for the Bible. There's thousands of copies, way more than other ancient literature. There's a very, very short time gap, and the differences are insignificant. And then I had what I call an aha moment. So science has actually looked at your brain, and when you have an aha moment, it's actually lighting up. That's why you feel that way. Aha. So even though I got this far with authentic, it seemed pretty good. What about those miracles? Certainly those stories, those legends got added over time by these scribes. Well, here's where my aha moment kind of came in. If you assume that a scribe embellished something here, or they added a story in this particular manuscript, and then another scribe entered something here, and another scribe maybe entered something here, so we get these wildly different stories, right? Well, at the end, they should be different. The stories would be different if they got added, and they're not. The stories are actually very consistent across the manuscripts. So I like to add in a little humor when I can, and that's pretty tough to do when you're talking about textual criticism. So I've added a couple jokes, and you'll have to bear with me, and they kind of lead me into my next session. So what did one eye say to the other? Between you and me, something smells. If I see a crime at the Apple store, does it make me an eyewitness? Get the eye? So that leads me into my next section we're going to talk about. I'm going to introduce an apologist named J. Warner Wallace. Turns out he was a cold case, or he still is a cold case detective, solves some of the toughest, coldest crimes. He's been on Dateline, somewhat famous. Well, he was an atheist, a strong atheist, and he ridiculed his fellow Christian officers, and he ridiculed those in the back that he's taking to jail. Let's say they're Christians. Then one day he was in church. It's a similar story. He was supporting his wife. He didn't believe it, though. And the pastor said one day that Jesus is the smartest man that ever lived. And that caught his attention. He said he ran out and he bought a really cheap little New Testament book, and he started going through it. He's going to use his cold case skills. Things like the events are in the distant past. The eyewitnesses aren't living anymore. There's little evidence from that past. And he's going to use that against the Bible. He's going to refute the Bible. Well, he ended up writing a book called Cold Case Christianity. He became a Christian based on what he did, based on what he found. And his book, when I was going through my journey, was an eye-opener for me. No pun intended. He talks about eyewitness testimony, that the Gospels are eyewitness testimony. I never saw that before, and it made a big difference to me. We convict in a court of law based on eyewitness testimony. Sometimes putting someone to death based on testimony. And there's no doubt when you look in the New Testament that they claim to be eyewitnesses, that they've seen, they've heard, they've touched all themselves. Earlier, I was talking about the inconsistencies across a book. I want to take a moment to talk about the inconsistencies across the stories of the different books. Luke says something one way, John would say it another way, Matthew says it another way, and that really bothered me because it was another sign to me that they weren't eyewitness testimony, that it wasn't honest, it wasn't truthful, that they were adding stories because they were different. And again, it really bugged me. But it didn't bother J. Warner Wallace. And I'm going to show a short video here with J. Warner Wallace talking about this.
I never flinched for a minute on the differences I saw between accounts. That didn't bother me. I had other issues, but that wasn't one of them. And I'll tell you why, because by this time, at 35, I had been working multiple eyewitness accounts for nearly a decade. And I realized early on that no two eyewitnesses ever agree. Ever. It could happen right now. It could happen while we're creating this tape. And do you know that you'll get two witnesses who will disagree about what happened 5 minutes ago? This happens all the time. There's variation between the resurrection accounts, absolutely. And that gave me great confidence because it's exactly the kind of variation I would expect to see if the resurrection accounts are real eyewitness accounts. And yes, they vary exactly to the degree I would expect them to.
So these are eyewitness accounts, and they're different authors. And these authors are writing to a different audience for a different purpose. Mark is writing to the Romans, it's action-packed. Matthew is writing to the Jews, Luke is writing to the Greeks, and John is writing to the unbelievers. So of course they're going to tell their stories differently. They're trying to reach a different audience who will resonate with things differently. So it turns out that the inconsistencies that bothered me actually supported a truthful story. So I started, adding up the evidence. And this is a little bit of a summary of the authentic evidence that I found. And there's many manuscripts. There's a short time gap. There's insignificant differences. And we have eyewitness testimony. And you'll notice some numbers are missing here. It's because I didn't have time to go into all the evidence. In addition, we have disciple writings during that gap period I talk about. We have writings we can look at. We have evidence that the resurrection is a very, very early belief, not something that grew over time. And we have evidence on how meticulous the scribes are. Let's talk about facts. Let's talk about the Bible, and is it fiction or nonfiction? Fiction, made up people, made up places, vague details. Nonfiction, you'd have real people, real places, explicit details. So it's actually pretty easy to look at a book and kind of tease out whether it's fiction or nonfiction. We'll start with real places. Archaeology. It has consistently shown things in the Bible to be correct. What I have up here are actually things that critics say the Bible got wrong. But when archaeology found it, they actually got it right. We're going to look at a few of them. There's this term that Luke uses called polytarchs. And critics were adamant that this was a term that wasn't made any sense. They didn't have any other evidence of it. And so he got it wrong. But in 1876, they found an inscription on stone using that term as a definition for leaders, which was correct. And since then, they've found 64 references to that title. How about Pontius Pilate? We don't have hardly any evidence for Pontius Pilate. For many years, they said, we're not even sure he was real, that he was a leader in the Roman Empire. Well, it wasn't until 1961 when they found this stone in Caesarea Maritima. And in it, it names not only Pontius Pilate, and that he was the prefect of Judea, but that Tiberius was the Roman emperor at the time, which is correct. It was the correct time frame. They also found a ring in 1968, but they didn't actually know what it was because they couldn't decipher it. And in 2018, they had advanced technology, photography, and they were able to decipher that it actually says pilot on it. So they call it the pilot ring. Until 1968, there was no evidence, archaeology or physically, of a crucifixion. In 1968, they found an ankle bone with a nail through it. You see the nail is kind of bent, which is probably why they didn't take it out. They think he was probably crucified in around 70 AD during the revolts. But there's something else that's even more interesting. So yep, it proves it's a crucifixion. But what's more interesting is where they found it. Because they found it in an ossuary, in a bone box, in a tomb, with 2 chambers and 12 burial niches. And you might, well, what it shows is that a crucified victim can be buried properly in a Jewish tomb, which, of course, most of you probably realize that is the story of Jesus. They actually estimate that only 20% of the Holy Land has been excavated. Most of it's built on top, right? So you can imagine what else is there if only we could get to it. Craig Evans says in a podcast, nothing has been found that contradicts what's been reported in the Bible. So we can check that box. The Bible has real places. It's starting to look a little bit like nonfiction. What about people? Well, it names people all over the place. But not only the names, the titles of them and where they're from. This is 15 verses from Romans. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to summarize it for you. 27 names are named in that section. If I was to say to you, John went to the store to get something, there's a good chance you're going to say, which John are you talking about? Because I know a lot of Johns. John is a common name. In first century Palestine, there were common names. Jesus and Simon are actually just 2 of them. So when you look in the New Testament, you're going to see Jesus is qualified often, as well as Simon and other common names. Okay, real people, lots of them, all over the place. Real places. How about explicit details? Do we see explicit details? And I go through quite a bit here because it's kind of fun. This is a map. It's a map of the trip that Paul and Luke took from Caesarea by ship to Rome. And it's a pretty detailed map. How do you think they got that map? They got it from the explicit details that Luke recorded. He not only explains the whole route, he actually talks about prevailing winds at that time and why they had to sail a certain direction because of them. This is kind of interesting. There's stories in the Bible, if you're like me, you read them and you don't really think about them all that much. This one is interesting. About midnight, so they're on this trip, and the sailors suspected they were getting close to land. So why did they suspect it? A little earlier, Luke records that when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days. So it was cloudy. It's been cloudy. It's midnight. It's dark. They probably can't see the shore. Maybe they can hear the waves crashing. So they suspect it. So they took a sounding. They dropped something off the side to find the depth, and they found 20 fathoms, which is 120 feet. They went a little farther, 15 fathoms, which is 90 feet. They're getting close to shore. It's getting shallower. So they put down 4 anchors, and the next morning, they cast off those anchors in the sea. Interestingly enough, they found 4 anchors. The story's not as good as you think, but they did find 4 anchors. Unfortunately, they didn't know what they had. They melted down 2 of them. And by the way, they were found in 90 feet of water, about 40 yards apart. The 3rd one got lost. The 4th one does still exist. It's owned by a private party, and they have inspected it, and it does date to the 1st century. If we had all 4, that'd be great, but we don't. He says there's 276 persons. That's an explicit detail. Precise timelines. 3 months, 3 days, 1 day, 2nd day, 7 days. This is 3 verses from Acts. And in it, it names 11 nations and 6 nationalities. Both Luke and John record medical conditions, though they didn't know it at the time. Luke says that his sweat became like blood. John says when they pierced his side, blood and water came out. Both of those are odd. Who sweats blood? And why would water come out of my chest? They were eyewitnesses, just recording what they saw. The early disciples actually struggled with this. They thought it was allegory or symbolic. They didn't really know what to make of it. Well, it turns out, as medicine advances, we have learned that these are actually medical conditions. Again, they were just reporting what they saw. There's obscure things that you have to kind of look for. We have a story here from a couple different books. It talks about the Passover festival. It talks about green grass. It talks about plenty of grass and barley loaves. Why is that interesting? Because Passover is a real event. It happened. It was held in April, which is after the rainy season, which means there's lots of grass. And it's also after the barley season, so there's lots of barley loaves. Geography names a bunch of cities correctly. Hills, plateaus, bodies of water, elevation up and down. And it's really hard to fake that you know geography. You either know it or you don't. Talks about the government rules in 1st century Palestine, the Roman rules, how you can be imprisoned at your own expense, things like that. Plants and animals that are appropriate for the 1st century Palestine. Buildings, the building structures themselves. Customs at the time, I mentioned Passover, but we also have customs like purity and the Sabbath and all those details. And if you ever look at, if you apply this criteria, if you look at this evidence and you try to find it in the non-canonical books, like Gospel of Thomas and some of those, which I looked at a little bit, you don't find any of this detail. Most of them don't even name anything beyond Jerusalem. This is Sir William Ramsay. He was a famous archaeologist when he was alive. He became an archaeologist, he says, partly to refute Luke, because he thought the books were written in the 200s. He ended up saying, Luke is a historian of the first rank. In short, this author should be placed along with the greatest of historians. Because Luke names 95 people by name, 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without error. And William Ramsay shocked the intellectual world at the time because he became a Christian based on what he found. So, that's the 3rd box checked. The Bible looks like, based on the evidence, it is a work of nonfiction. When I started my journey, I didn't start with Christianity. I started with God. Because if there's no God, why would I look at any religion? So I started looking at that evidence first. And what I found was a whole lot of evidence. This is how I categorize it. And that evidence needed an explanation. Either this evidence is due to a creator, it's due to a God, or it's due to nature and materials. It's your only two choices. Well, when I looked at this and I looked at the atheists' explanations, I came away with the conclusion that they were inadequate. They were inadequate when they tried to describe the DNA that's in our bodies and the code that's in our bodies, the machines that are in every one of our cells, the origin of life, the complexity in our world, from the origin of the universe to the actual laws of nature, which most people don't think about. Where do those laws come from? And the fine-tuning in the world. The supernatural. There's lots of evidence of the supernatural. The afterlife, near-death experiences, consciousness, conscience, art, beauty, love. These are all things that are beyond nature. And the fact that something's wrong, evil and suffering. And when I unpack this, I actually believe that evil and suffering points more towards a God than it does away from it. So the way I like to say it when I talk about God is that I just had to change paths. Because the path I was on just kind of ended. It wasn't a big aha or anything like that. Just like, these explanations just don't cut it. The book I talked about earlier, Authentic Facts. You might imagine this is just tip of the iceberg, and it is. There's lots of evidence, just like for God, there's lots of evidence for Christianity that needs an explanation. Either it happened like the eyewitnesses said it did, or you have to come up with some other answer for it. And that led me to a second decision. First was God. Now I had to choose, is Christianity true? Do I submit? Do I give in? And it's a lot harder of a decision. Many of you know this. The things you have to change in your life. Forgiving people, being nicer to people, all the way down to your thoughts and how you live in your mind. And I have another problem that I haven't shared with you yet. It's a fear. It's a real fear. But first, we're going to look at some real fears other people have that I don't have. There's the fear of chins. Probably didn't know that, but it's real. There's the fear of the color yellow. That'd be a hard one to live with. And finally, this one's kind of funny. There's a fear of ketchup. I'm not going to pronounce it. It's a real fear, believe it or not. People afraid of ketchup. No, my fear, real fear, is the fear of being wrong. Paralyzes me. I don't like to buy anything because the next day it'll be on sale and I was wrong. How am I going to make this decision? I'm just a big old second guesser. Well, I thought about it for a while. Well, I'm kind of like a juror here. This is what jurors do every day when you're in a jury trial. You're going to get evidence shown to you, and you're going to get two sides, two explanations of that evidence. Defense attorney and the prosecutor, they're going to tell you different stories and explanations, but you're going to be looking at the same evidence. That's part of the rules in a court of law, that they have to disclose all the same evidence. So I said, well, let's look at jury instructions. A reasonable doubt is a doubt. It's not beyond all possible doubt, but it's a doubt, reasonable doubt based on common reason and common sense. And if you are convinced beyond that reasonable doubt that the defendant's guilty, then it's your duty to find that defendant guilty. So if I am convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the evidence shows that Christianity is true, then it's my duty to find Christianity true. Recall that my journey started back in 2008. I needed a moral standard. In 2011, I was baptized. So I did give in after 3 years. Seems longer than that. I was all in. I cleaned up my playlists. I cleaned up my library. I cleaned up my music. I led small groups. I tried to change things in me to be a better person. And that was all great, but unfortunately, in 2015, that fear, it gripped me again. Now, this was a bit secretively, but I just questioned everything again. Now I'm surrounded by Christians, and did I give atheism a fair shot? So I went back to the drawing board, and I started reading and listening to podcasts and debates again. And I got to this point, which many of you have probably gotten to before, where you start, I heard that. Oh yeah, I've heard that one. I'm going to fast forward through that. I've heard that. And I just kept saying, finally I'm like, I'm not hearing anything new here. I've heard all this. So in 2017, just a couple years after that, I was back where I started. That the best explanation is that Christianity is true. So I hope you enjoyed today's talk. So Jesus, thank you for the gifts that you have given me and the opportunity to speak to this audience. I hope that everybody in the audience, no matter where they are in the journey, have picked up something today to help them on their journey in a better life. Thank you very much.